We don't have video. All right. Cool. So this talk's actually about leveraging GitHub's GraphQL API. Has anybody seen a talk about GraphQL at all up until this point? Watched a video? I asked other people before, who's using GraphQL on the side at work? Okay, cool. Awesome. So I'm still the expert, so I can say whatever. All right, so I am going to talk about that. My slides, I didn't realize that we were going to email our slides to the organizers, so you can get them from them, or you can just go to bit.ly/yellow-mustard. I like to put memorable things, so people, it's like bit.ly/168H, capital J. Yeah, so yellow mustard. So I'm going to talk about GraphQL. It seems like it's going to be new for a lot of people in the room. Totally fine. You don't have to be an expert because there's really not much to it, to be honest. There's a little bit to it, but there's a lot of stuff around GraphQL that you have to learn. GraphQL actually is a spec. So it's something that Facebook actually, they worked internally, got to the point where like Lee Bryan and team were kind of like, hey, we got this thing, it's kind of working for us, but we could probably use extra help. So they open sourced the spec. So the idea of what it looks like for a query language. And then from there, people kind of started adopting it. So then you have other companies that are now jumping on the bandwagon, like GitHub. GitHub now uses GraphQL as their public-facing API. It's the version 4 API. But before in the GraphQL, I wanted to share a little story. I'm not that old. Okay, I'm pretty old. I'm 32. I know it's not that old. I'm like in the middle of the road. But I wasn't around for Grandmaster Flash. My parents were. They were big fans. They actually lived in New York at the time. Grandmaster Flash, anybody heard of them? So they were like one of the first rap groups. Like everybody was like, Sugar Hill Gang is like the first rap music video. Yes, cool. But Grandmaster Flash was the first to bring it to the Bronx. It came at the time in the late 70s where disco, you guys ever heard of disco? So maybe some of us were around for that time. So disco was really big. And there was like this new genre of music that was coming on the cusp of disco. It was like the next wave. So we had like punk coming on the rock side, and we had like hip hop that was coming through the Grandmaster Flash and Gang in the Furious Five. And I got really into the history of hip hop because of this show. Now this is a show on Netflix. You guys ever heard of Get Down? It's in there. Who has a Netflix account? Only a couple of us? Okay, yeah. Netflix is a thing. People are using it. So there's a show called The Get Down. It got canceled after 2 seasons. I know, sad. But it was really cool because it actually went around the time of Grandmaster Flash era, and when disco was super popular, as rap and hip hop and graffiti and everything was coming up through the Bronx, where most of hip hop was created in New York. And I really liked it because it's almost like a Japanese anime with live action people with no Japanese people. Like it's a weird combination. The director really went on. I think that's probably why it got canceled, because he kind of went out there on what he did. I think everything about the show was awesome, including the music. The only thing I cannot attest to is Jaden Smith. Not very good at acting. All right. So 1979, also around that time, there was actually a really popular, there was a rock concert that actually happened, I think in the Northeast, I forget the city, but it was like a really popular DJ on the radio started saying that disco sucks and that disco is dead. And they had in one of the stadiums, I think it was actually in Boston, that's where it was, they had everybody bring their disco records and they burned them. Like it was a huge thing, and it was actually at that time. And that was like, a lot of people cite that as the time when disco died. It was actually the same time that Grandmaster Flash and everybody in the Bronx was coming up. So it was a very interesting time.
You went to a stadium full of vinyl records?
Something like that. They had like a bonfire.
Some nasty fumes.
I'm pretty sure they didn't know about fumes back then.
In Boston, you couldn't tell.
Yeah. Some people were from there. All right. So I would honestly say disco is not dead. And as I watched this whole series, I learned all about like how hip hop's made. Like a lot of hip hop is built on top of like DJs, like people making music. Nowadays, you don't really have like people turning tables, but you do have people who are producing music. You have MCs who are rapping. You've got the scene, the dance scene, like new, whatever that Backpack Kid thing or whatever it is. Like that thing, new stuff comes out every year. But a lot of that was built on the backs of disco. So it's important to know like where you came from. One person that I really, really appreciate, I know he's been in the news for other reasons besides his music, but when Kanye West, this is a picture of Kanye West, he's a rap artist, now a fashion mogul, or whatever that means, he makes shoes. It's actually worth $1 billion. Why? I don't know. His shoes are ugly. Anyway, so he actually changed the game by sampling disco. He actually changed it because his mom, who he cites a lot in his music, grew up during that age. So his mom's like older than my mom, but she grew up that age. He grew up in the house listening all these Shaka Khan and all these songs through in the disco, like Earth, Wind, and Fire. So he took those elements of disco 20 years prior to his, like even like when around the time he was born, and added it to his music. And he actually changed it for the turn of like the 2000s. He came on the scene. He was very different. Where at the time we had to be very gangster to do rap. He came on the scene and he wore his pants on his waist. He wore button-up shirts, collars, sweaters. Like he was very different. Changed the game completely. So much that like one of the very first songs that came through the wire was actually sampled through a Shaka Khan song, like Through the Fire, like literally almost the same title. And I would say like as developers, we see that same sort of thing happen over and over again. I think I'm talking about GraphQL all day. You guys probably like give it a rest. What are you talking about with all this disco stuff? I'm getting there. Like here's a slide where I start talking tech. So I'm going to compare a lot of like GraphQL to REST. REST is probably the most thing that like a lot of us are using REST APIs. I don't know if everybody else is using any older technologies or other enterprise solutions. I can't really speak on that because I've always done open source and on that side. But the biggest question, like a lot of people are asking, is about GraphQL and does it kill REST? Like, is it a thing that we have to stop learning REST now and do GraphQL? We're done. I won't answer that question. But before I do that, I want to talk about the thing I like talking about the most, which is myself. I'm Brian Douglas. I'm a developer advocate at GitHub. I'm BDougieO on Twitter. I'm BDougie on GitHub. I wore the wrong sweater. Actually, Melon Song downstairs, she's also at the booth. She has her name. All employees have their names on their sweaters. I just have too many sweaters that I thought I grabbed the right one. Anyway, not important. I work at GitHub. I've been there, as I said before, since February. It's been an awesome ride. I love it. We're hiring. We have awesome paternal benefits that I talked about. If you want to ask questions about that, feel free to stop me. I also want to say, if you have questions during the talk, I'm totally fine to stop and answer them. We do have a lot of time, and I have enough to say for an hour, but I can also answer questions. I know a lot of this is going to be new for a lot of people, so I'm happy to slow down. But I don't want to go over time for the next person, so we'll just keep that in mind. I also reserve the right not to answer your question if I don't know the answer. So just saying. All right, so GitHub. Last summer, we had the GitHub version 4 of our API. So we had like GitHub's been around for 10 years. We now have 4 versions of our API. The biggest thing that happened during this API version is that we went all GraphQL. So is REST dead? We'll get there. But this one really into GraphQL. GraphQL at that time was only around for 1 year in public facing. It was around for at least 9 months prior in beta phase. So that way people can test it out, try it out at the companies, but they were recommending people not use it publicly. GitHub went full GraphQL before they actually launched it in August of last year as like a full, like we are supporting this, Facebook supporting it, a couple other companies supporting it. Around that time, my first time actually introduced in the GraphQL was around GraphQL Summit. The very first GraphQL Summit in San Francisco. It was hosted by Meteor/Apollo and supported by some other local companies like Airbnb and Facebook. We're all just kind of testing out GraphQL, but not using it really in production. And I found out that GitHub was one of the first companies outside of Facebook using it in production. So I reached out to Kyle Daigle, who's now Director of Engineering at Ecosystem. At the time, he was like senior engineer. So like, oh, cool, I know famous director. But anyway, I got to meet him. He got to talk about GraphQL and how GitHub implemented it. I do recommend if you do want to listen to that, find out that background story, more of that, check it out. You'll have to listen to me again for about 30 minutes because I'm the one talking, but not a big deal. That podcast is called Jamstack Radio. And what Jamstack is JavaScript APIs and markup. It's like a term I like to use for the modern development because does anybody not use JavaScript and work on the web? It's not possible. Is it possible? I guess you could just be backend heavy. Yeah, it's totally possible. Well, what is possible is this. So a lot of people are very used to like these monolithic architectures. I know we came from we did like web where everything was simple. You had like the CSS page. You could view source. It was beautiful. Then like WordPress came, Web 2.0, stuff got a little hairy. And then all these monolithic frameworks like Rails and Django and all these, Java has more too, as like Play and stuff like that. But anyway, that's like a monolith. I like to use the analogy of like peanut butter and jelly in the same jar. They still sell this on the shelf. I'm not a big fan, okay, but I'm not going to knock anybody who loves monolithic sandwiches, okay? I'm a big fan of this. So separate my front end, separate my back end. Don't merge the two. If you want to do CSS and JavaScript, cool, go to that corner. If you want to hang out with me at the back end, guys, we're over here in the peanut butter land. Like, I like having that separation and like that clean break because I actually, the startup before I was at, when I was before GitHub, my task was actually to do front end work. And we had to switch from Angular to React. And what made it easier is that we had the front end separate from the back end, so there was no dependency on the back end. So if I wanted to change the library on the front end, it does not break the API. So it's really important. If you can't change your API or new versions, then things always are challenging, and it's going to be way more work. But then some people actually take on that. Like, that's totally fine if that's a thing that you like to do. It's just not for me. So I'm going to get off this whole peanut butter jelly train and disco and all this stuff and talk about REST. So REST endpoints, actually Nisha just had to talk about her using REST endpoints to use IoT buttons to deploy releases. So a lot of times you'll use like api.yoursite.com or some sort of like URL to get to your API. Like GitHub is api.github.com. So if you wanted to curl that, you can actually get information back. So these endpoints are almost pretty self-explanatory. Like if I go to /user on my API, I'm going to go to user. And I broke this out like this. So I have my GitHub API, and then I have my app. So a lot of times people will build on top of GitHub. You have tools like Travis and Waffle and all these companies that are building their platform on top of GitHub. It's very similar to a lot of other APIs. So like back in the early 2010s, there were like tons of Twitter clients built on top of Twitter's API. And then Twitter said, nah, we're good. And they shut it down. But anyway, back in the day, it was cool. You could do a lot of bots. So that's a GitHub API. So if I go to /user in my REST endpoints within the documentation, what do you think I'm going to get?
User information?
Yeah, you got user information. So that's me on GitHub. I use that sort of avatar everywhere. So if I went to /repositories, what do you think I'm going to get?
Repository information?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, these are easy questions. I should have prefaced that. So I'll get a bunch of GitHub repositories, a list, probably an array or JSON data. Actually, it will be JSON data. I'm 100% sure on that. So /notifications, what do you think I'm going to get? No. Unfortunately, it's not notifications. It's there's like this huge problem where like you don't know what you're going to get unless you sort of just fish your documentation. So one of my biggest pet peeves is like when I go to a new engineering team and I need to learn the stack or learn how to operate or just code in that environment, there's a lot of learning. So like if there's no tests, no docs, then I have to do it all as a new engineer, or else I'm just going to pull my hair out, which my hair is a little thinning. Like my hairline is receding a little bit. Don't look too closely. But like I don't need to lose any more hair to try to like get notifications from my GitHub API. So actually, does anybody know who this rapper is? Probably not. I don't know. He's from Atlanta, so we're really far away. Who is it? Yeah, it is Gucci Mane. Yeah. So yeah, that's Gucci Mane. He's the godfather of trap music. If you guys hate mumble rap, he made it. So he's that guy. So he's going to show up a little bit. So you don't need to know his music. It's okay. But he's also big in the sampling. I just wanted to bring this up, that this is a common reoccurrence to rap music and hip hop, as well as rock music, that's sampling. So he actually took a disco queen. You guys know the song from Minnie Riperton, "Loving You is easy 'cause you're beautiful." South Park did it. That's how I know it. But anyway, he took that song and made a really, really dirty song out of it. But you don't need to listen to that. So these are REST endpoints. Instead of notifications, it's actually user/notifications. But how would you have known that? By just trying it probably and getting error messages and looking at docs. So like there is a point where you get to the point where like when you look at your new REST API or you get on a new team, like you'll get lost in the docs, you'll get lost in trying to figure out how to work things out. And the question is like, how is GraphQL different from REST? Well, you guys want the answer?
Yep.
I mean, do you want the answer? Just kidding. All right, so what GraphQL does, it lets you replace REST that you would normally make multiple requests. So like all those requests could be for one page or one interaction or one feature that you're trying to work on. You might have to hit like 10 is not a word. Yeah, either many or 10. I'm trying to do one or the other, but let's just say 10. So you might have to hit 10 REST endpoints, but with GraphQL, you just get to hit 1. So that's the difference. That's a big difference. You just consume /GraphQL API to github.com/GraphQL. And it looks like this. So rather than like boom, 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 try to get all these different REST endpoints or maybe even batch them together, you just do GraphQL /GraphQL. And that's my app. That's GitHub's GraphQL API. And that's /GraphQL. And I'll show you some of this in a bit because I do have an app I built that you could actually look at on yourself. And it's hosted on GitHub, of all places. So I do want to point out that GraphQL is not a replacement for REST. It's an alternative for querying data. I think it's more beneficial for front-end developers or consumers, mobile developers as well. So anyone consuming for a client being like the app that's not the backend or the API, it's beneficial for them because like what happens is I need to add a new feature on a page. Okay, it's going to be in a dashboard and I need user information. I start coding it out on the front end. Oh, turns out I don't have notifications. I have to either do it myself or go back into the backend team and say, hey, notifications is not in the blob that I'm getting from JSON. Can you add it? Okay, 2 weeks later, it's added because that's how long it takes for backend people to do it. So it gives you sprints. Anyway, so you get it in the backend and then, oh, okay, cool. Oh, you know what? We just added like new like blurry images before like, anticipated loading or some new information like LinkedIn information. I need that. Backend team, can I get that? Okay, 2 weeks later. So we're like a month later trying to get front-end stuff. The back and forth, like if you're a full stack dev, that's totally fine. My last job, I was actually quote unquote a full stack dev. I was doing JavaScript by default because no one wanted to do it when I was hired. So I became a JavaScript developer. I literally never did any front-end development until my last job. And it was mainly because no one else wanted to do it. And I just thought it was interesting to learn. Turns out that was a mistake because then I became the senior Redux developer, but that's another talk. So the cool thing about this is that it fits in my jam. That was like why this slide's here. So we're going to talk about 2 interactions of GraphQL. So we have 2 things that you really just need to know about GraphQL, especially if you want to interact with GitHub's GraphQL API. Queries, mutations. The cool thing about queries in GraphQL is that you define the shape of data that you want, and that same shape of data gets returned in JSON. Now that sounds weird when I say it like sort of esoterically, but actually here's a image. So like I have my GraphQL query. So this is going to be query. I'll talk about mutations in a sec. Queries are just like get requests. So if you know REST, I'm just getting data from my backend. So I just defined that I want repository owner Netlify, which is the company I used to work for, and I want their open source project Go True JS. So I'm just going to define that I want based on Netlify's user on GitHub. Sorry, I'm actually hitting the GitHub API on this. I'm going to grab that one repo. And from that one repo, I want this data, the name, all its issues, and then how many issues count. So then when I go over here, I've got the repository owner. So my JSON, anybody work with JSON day to day? So you're familiar, you've seen this pattern. So I got repository owner, which I've named here. Sitting in my JSON, I've got repository, which I've named here, and this is the shape I'm defining. And then I've got my object as well inside of there, which is named GoTrueJS, issues, total count's 13. So I've got 13 issues on that one repo. So I'm just grabbing the data that I think I want. The cool thing, go ahead.
So those names, are they defined in some backend schema, or where do those names come from?
So I don't have this picture because this is mostly on the consumption side, but yes, it is defined. So like the backend team will set up all the data and all the endpoints that are available to you, and then the front end team just grabs what they need and what they don't need. So like, notice I didn't grab like stars, or I didn't grab organizers, or sorry, contributors is the actual term, organizers, where did that come from? So I'm not grabbing that information because I don't need it for this actual data grab. But that's defined on the back end. Now, if something's not there or something new gets added, GraphQL, you don't need to cut a new release to add more information. Like in REST, you have like v3, v4, v4, 5, yeah, 5 is after 4, 6. Like you have to cut a new release when you make breaking changes to your API. With GraphQL, you can do deprecations, which in GraphQL Europe, if you're really interested in hearing, one of our engineering managers actually talked about how we do deprecations in the GitHub API. We haven't been doing that long, so we haven't actually had that many deprecations that we needed to do. But that's mainly like name changing. So like, I forgot the major one, but it's mainly like, I think we switched viewer, which is like the person who's logged into the API, to something, a different name, but that's like the only thing. and we found that not a lot of people are using it. Question?
So somewhere you include a GitHub specific library that has functions like repository or filter identifiers or whatever the name repository under, whereas if you were working with Facebook data, you would include a different library that has different querying and sorting.
So for your question, the schema is actually defined on the back end. Facebook schema is way different than GitHub's. Like Facebook has a different use case, a business case. Like GitHub is a business case. So similar to REST, like if you hit endpoints, like Facebook's not going to have repos on their backend or their API.
And do you include these functions or this schema in a query file or in the configuration for your query?
You're jumping ahead. I got a slide for that.
Okay.
So this is just me defining the shape of the data. I'll show you my project in a couple slides. Mutations. So if you think of queries as GET requests, mutations are posts. So you're going to destructively do something to your database. So this is something super trivial, which I'll go into way more detail on. Add a reaction to an issue. Like it's just, I want to add create a mutation that adds a reaction to a specific issue. And that's based on this subject ID. And this information, we'll figure out how to actually understand this. Like a lot of times in REST APIs, you'll have to look at the ref docs to check out what sort of stuff you're getting. GraphQL is a really elegant way of doing this. And if you use VS Code, it's even better. How do you get started with the GraphQL API? So that's like a question I'm going to jump into. And I would say Gucci Mane says GraphQL Explorer. I told you he's going to be here, so just get used to him. So we have this thing called the GraphQL Explorer on our documentation page, and it looks like this. So developer.github.com, that's all of our docs, anything for developers who want to interact, not host repositories, but if you want to interact with our API, that's all the information. Anybody ever been to their developer docs at all? You guys all just using man pages? Actually, who's actually use our API? There's a handful of us? Okay. Cool, yeah. It's really awesome to use our API for things like to workflow management, improving certain things. If you guys do stuff that could be automated, you can leverage our API. Or create IoT buttons to create releases. But this is the GraphQL Explorer, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually querying. You don't really actually need to see what this is. My slides will be in wherever the slide people will take them for the organizers. But yeah, I'm just grabbing same pattern, bdougie, open sourced, and I am grabbing a name, a URL. I'm grabbing just the first issue for some reason, just for the example. I'm just grabbing one issue. And then on that issue, I'm going to grab the total count and then find out the data within each issue, which I'll get into more detail about. But in the Explorer, it's broken up into 3 different sections. I'll talk about 2 real quick. So this is the query. Now, your query can have a mutation. It can have a query. It's a get, a post, whatever. All the actions you want to do to get data, you can get the query out of there. And then the second side is going to be the data. So that's just JSON, because that's what we choose to deliver contents of our API to. And when I first found out about the GraphQL API for GitHub, I was really interested in GraphQL. I learned a lot about it, but I didn't have like a use case. Like I wasn't going to just stop production and be like, guys, stop. I learned this new thing. It's called GraphQL. We need to stop shipping features, and we need to try this out. Like that wasn't a possibility for where I was working. It's probably not a possibility for most of us where we're working, unless you're like working in your own project or you're VC funded and you can just like do whatever you want. But most of us can't do whatever we want, so we have to do side projects, and that's what I did. So I thought of a project, and I thought of like GitHub's API as a place for open source. Like it's a place to find repositories and new languages and technology. And I really wanted to get into open source. It was like something that I always wanted to do consistently. Like I ship features to projects and then I sort of ghost them, or it's hard to get into because you don't know what the code is or who the people are, and no one ever answers your questions. Actually, that was the opposite of what I got. People actually do answer my questions, but it's hard to get into open source. And as I mentioned, like every time I find a project, I don't know where to start. And then I thought of a quote that I heard on the internet from Gucci Mane. If you don't got sauce, then you lost. This is actually, it makes no sense. I'm sorry, but it was literally an interview on YouTube, a YouTube interview of this guy, and they were at some party or something, and he was talking about how becoming a rapper, like you have to have sauce. And he was just doing nonsensical like answers to his questions, and then he was just like, yeah, you just gotta have sauce. Like if you don't got sauce, then you lost. And that's what I kind of felt like open source. Like I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. I don't got sauce. So what I did is I created an open source project to manage your open source projects. So I wanted like a tool where I could like sort of creep on open source projects and like save issues off GitHub and sort of like kind of track them. And then when I'm ready to jump in and I've done enough like digging into it, then I can just jump in and be like, oh, cool, I got the answer. Here's your code. So I did it and I called it open sourced. So this is my super, I built, that's a lot of build up for a very bland app. My apologies. I'm not a UI designer by any, like I'm not a designer at all. So if you guys are, this is open source. So bring the PRs, please. But yeah, basically I just got some projects that I was super interested in. Like I have my project on here. This is so totally redundant. That was me testing. Good.com is not a repo. But I've got all these projects and I want to stalk them. I want to stalk their issues. I want to pick out the issues I want to contribute to without jumping in the issues and being like a weirdo and like, hey guys, hey, hello fellow kids, I'm here to code. I just wanted to like kind of stalk before I jumped in. And I also wanted a way to like save and take notes like off of GitHub. So I just created this little platform for me to do that. And this is what it looks like. So OpenSauce is here. It's a React app. It's built using GraphQL and Apollo, which I'll get into in a sec. And I'm using GitHub as my backend. So I'm just literally just fetching data through GraphQL from GitHub. And then I'm taking that, like sort of looking at the data, and then I'm saving it to a tool called GraphQL. GraphQL is like, if you guys ever heard of Firebase or Parse, it's sort of like a backend, like DynamoDB or something like that. It's like a backend as a service. So this is basically just log in with your GitHub account and you give you a backend for free, up to a certain amount. But like, this is me. I'm not gonna start paying for anything. So basically, I use that tool to save my notes for GraphQL. And as I mentioned, I'm using GitHub as a platform, which is totally possible. Like a lot of people are doing this and building companies and making lots of money, and they're great. But I'm just here to have fun. So I'm using GitHub as a platform. And this is what I'm looking at. It's like GitHub plus GraphQL equals open sourced. I feel like it's a VC pitch. You guys VCs in here? Because this is going to change the world. So I'm going to talk about how I fetch data, and this is like mainly the sort of part where I'm actually consuming the data from GitHub, and how you can start testing GitHub's GraphQL API without building a funny project, or it's not funny, right? It's a goofy project based on Gucci Mane's random talk or interview. So what I'm doing is I'm fetching repo data, and the way I'm doing that is as I mentioned, I'm just going to focus on this part, this fetching data from GitHub into my app. And the way I do it is with a form, right? Because that's how the web was started, through forms. Probably not. So I'm just basically putting in a repo URL. I'm clicking that. I'm hitting GitHub's GraphQL data, and then I get to populate it here. Mainly the reason why I'm doing that is because sometimes the data is off or missing or something like that, especially like how many contributors for some reason was like hit or miss for me. So I was just manually inputting that, and then I just click that save button, and I have it in my list. So I start off by just grabbing a repo and then adding it into the form.
So this looks like a React app where everything is client-side. Do you have any server-side component of this?
No. So, sorry, ask a question?
What if you need to do like an adapted data object, or GitHub's giving me something back, but I want to like mess with it or move some properties around before I actually consume it on the rest of my site?
Yeah, so if those of you who aren't familiar with React, the question was like basically like, what am I doing for like the back end or manipulating data like on the fly? Yeah. Or even like persisting it somewhere? For the most part, I wasn't doing any of that. Like this is like me a couple weekends, like just throwing together. I'm just using regular React state, which is like literally web browser storage is what that's built on top of. So I'm just using that. You could use Redux. You could save this to Dynamo. I've actually had someone, I actually shared this project a while ago, and someone actually approached me and said I could just use a GitHub gist as my storage. So you can actually just take the text, like a JSON blob of this code, save it into a gist, like a private gist, and that could be your storage, like literally.
But okay, like what if you had, say, hey, give me all these repositories, but then I want to store stars, like not at the repository level, but I want the stars thing to belong to a user or something. Like what if the way GitHub gave you the data wasn't something that you could readily work with?
Yeah.
It seems like you're entirely dependent on GitHub schema.
Yeah,
this way.
I am. I think you might be ahead of me on some slides.
Okay.
I have my own schema. I'll get to that. Okay. Ask the question again if I don't answer it. I think I answered your question. So far, I've talked about a lot of JavaScript. I just wanted to just kind of point out that GraphQL gets paired with like React and JavaScript because it came from Facebook and that's where it came out at first. I want to say that GraphQL is not JavaScript. Like you do not need JavaScript to do GraphQL. GraphQL works with Scala, it works with Ruby, it works with Python, it works with Go, it works with almost every language that you can think of that you're touching. Someone has built either a very simple, crappy library or a very productive, useful library on it. So there's at least someone who started the work for you. So if there's something that's not out there, you go to graphql.org, there's a list of different libraries to get yourself started. And there's another link which I'll show later. But this is my JavaScript, this is my React app, this is me fetching repo data from GraphQL. I'm taking so on the third line, I've got my GitHub URL, which is api.github.com/GraphQL. That's the only endpoint I have to hit. And then from there, I'm using Axios because I'm a big fan. You can use whatever you want. I'm not here to judge. But I'm just taking that GitHub URL and then fetching the data. And then I produce that data onto my form that we just saw previously. So I'm just looking at the data. Like I'm not saving in it at that point. I'm just fetching data as I hit that button. So sorry, and then also this app is super trivial too. So like I did not go in like the weeds of like trying to solve performance or like legitimate issues. I was just solving one issue and that was my issue. So that's my GraphQL endpoint. I did point that out. So I just highlighted that there. And then this is my actual query. So this repo query is something that I'm actually saving on the page, which I'll show you. But you could actually you guys know JavaScript, you can just import stuff from other other files and libraries, and that's what this is. So I have a function where I identify my schema that I want to pull out, and it's based on the schema that I know is available to me from GitHub. Now, I know this because I tested this on the GraphQL Explorer, so I just tested it inline on the actual development page. I got the data I wanted to, and I just copied that and put it into a template string. So if you're familiar with like the ECMAScript Next or ES6, you can do template strings to do. You can write strings without worrying about space and stuff like that, or escaping characters and stuff like that. So, you guys familiar with ES6 JavaScript? Am I explaining way too much on that? Okay. So that's my repo query, and then, like as I said, like this is me just grabbing that same sort of information from GraphQL Explorer, and I get to test and see the data. So I guess what I'm getting at so far is like, if you've never used GraphQL, you can check it out today. Like, how many people have a GitHub account? So pretty much everybody, almost everybody in this room can go in the GraphQL Explorer and start manipulating with the GraphQL data today. So just try it out. So I haven't really talked about documentation. Like I was talking about how hard it is to like figure out like documentation, find out what the history of your API was, like is it V2, V3, whatever. Find out what endpoints are available to me. Some of the biggest gripes for me with the GitHub API is like I don't know what anything's called. Like if you wanted to find out how many stars on a repo, do you guys know what to use for that? It's an attribute called stargazers. Like stargazers, I don't know. I guess it's people who created stars. I wasn't there when they created it. I don't know that. So the cool thing about GraphQL Explorer, and this GraphQL in general, like I do want to point out that a GraphQL Explorer is something that GitHub built in the web. This is the same pattern that people use. So GraphQL's got like the GraphQL playground. There's also Graphical. So it's like the graphical IDE where you can actually do this on like an Electron app as well. Looks exactly the same. The really cool thing about that is that Explorer is not just a playground, it's like live data. There's actually now a warning on top of the page that says, don't do anything, this is live data. So if you try to do mutations, it will work. Another cool thing is that the documentation's inline. So this is all the documentation's written on the schema level. The cool thing about this is that you can require your backend team to write documentation as they ship features. So if you have a Stargazer endpoint and you have no idea what that is, you have to require them to say, okay, tell me what a Stargazer is before I can accept this PR. Or you can just let it fly, who cares? Put it in production. But the cool thing is I can actually find out the data I need by just going to the documentation there. So if I don't know what issue or PR or how to get those data, I can actually just go in the documentation and learn it. And I'll show you that in a sec. So more Gucci Mane. I don't know if you guys knowing, his like weight is going up and down. Like the earlier, skinnier photos is actually the later photos. He was actually put in prison for a bit, and he came out like super ripped. So this is actually before prison. It's totally back, this guy. All right, so no more fishing through GitHub's API documentation. It's like not a thing. You can actually just search directly inline in Explorer or whatever sort of graphical IDE you want to use. So I'm not up to date with VS Code, but like I put my money on VS Code being the like if they don't have it yet, having some pretty legit like GraphQL documentation searching like built into your IDE. It's probably just a plugin away. Talk about pagination edges. So I told you I wanted to I showed you the form. I'm just saving the data in the state, and I'm sitting at the GraphQL. What I wanted to do is actually display issues because my whole goal was basically just track issues and basically save issues to GraphQL so that way I can know. I didn't really explain this very well. So I guess my biggest problem is whenever I go on Hacker News or I go on a newsletter, I'll see a really cool project and I'm like, oh, it's so cool. And then when I finally have time to look at it or a time to actually contribute to it, I forgot the name. So I wanted to actually save repos and then not forget when I actually did have free time or I had time off or a weekend to kill. So that's what it is. So I wanted to be able to display issues, and I could actually search for issues based on title, and then click through, open up GitHub, and decide if I wanted to save this issue. So issues are, these things called edges are basically arrays or sort of like groups of data. They're called edges in GraphQL. I'm not sure if it's used in any other language. Edges, is that a term that you guys have heard in any other language?
Other graph query languages.
Okay, yeah. So GraphQL is my only experience in graph query and theory and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm just not, I guess, up to speed on that. But I guess I should probably look into that since I'm talking about it. But yeah, thank you for that, though. So each edges have nodes inside of them. So each node has these attributes, or sorry, not these attributes. Each edge has these attributes. And then with those attributes, they have nodes, and you can get stuff so issues have stars, issues have comments, all that data I can get through. And I can discover all this. So I actually learned all this through just clicking through GraphQL documentation. My history of the GitHub API, though I work at GitHub, I've been working with GitHub through their API of various companies pretty much my entire career. And mainly because I've been working at SF-based startups, and everybody loves GitHub and SF. And so my experience has been me working with another engineer and them telling me exactly what I need to do, or me going to the reference docs and just going straight to the reference docs, scrolling, looking at the shape, look at the REST data, look at the query, seeing if that works, which is great. The only problem is sometimes you can get rate limited with GitHub. We have if you're not logged in or off through our REST endpoint, you can get rate limited really quickly. I actually had for another company, I was at a booth for that company, and you could deploy your site, your repo, into production, if it was a site, like an HTML site, from the booth. And we got rate limited because we had more than 50 people do it at the conference. And it's basically on the same IP. If you are not logged in, then that IP will get blocked after I think it's even lower. It's 25. So after 25 people did it, that IP for the conference Wi-Fi was blocked. So the only way you could do it is actually get off the Wi-Fi and do it. So luckily, we actually slacked back home. We had a former GitHub employee who was on the API team, and we had him message his friends at GitHub and be like, "Hey, can we unmask? Not unmask. Can we unblock this IP?" And they did it at GitHub, and we were like, "Oh, cool! Now we can abuse their IP or their API." Anyway, so yeah, you can get rate limited really quickly. Has anybody been rate limited by third-party APIs? Just testing things out. Yeah, you get a bunch of hackers in this room. All right. So the cool thing about this is that you have edges, and that it actually limits it for you. So all that rate limiting is built in the GraphQL for you as part of the schema, which I'll talk about in a sec. This is me zooming in on the documentation side, so I can find out basically what these issues and what's inside of them and what's inside of an edge. As I mentioned, limiting is built in, so each edge you can actually set limits. For GitHub, all across the board, the default limit is 100. So you can only get 100 repos at a time, and you have to re-request the next 100 if you'd like. That's mainly to diffuse abuse. I mean, it's very easy to probably scrape. Actually, we don't put emails in the API for obvious reasons, but if you were a recruiter, you could just scrape GitHub profiles based on certain tags and then grab a bunch of emails, but you can only get 100. So. But you can't get emails, but you can get names and stuff like that. So for obvious reason, GitHub does not want to be the next LinkedIn. You can quote me on that. So here's fetching issues. So with the actual rate limiting and having nodes at 100, I didn't actually know how to do this until I started digging into GraphQL in the GitHub API. So it's really cool that you can actually use a real API to test this out, because this is how I learned how to use GraphQL. So I had to figure out that since you only limited 100 and you have to actually pick what 100 you want or which 100 you need, English. So I'm just grabbing the first 5 and I paginate through each 5. And that's basically the way I'm working with it, because most projects that I'm looking at have less than 50 issues. And the ones that have way more, I probably don't want to work on. So I'm limiting to 100 records, and that's just me grabbing the first 5. And that's just what my pagination looks like. So it's just literally, again, I'm not a designer, but I have 5 issues in these little boxes, and I can actually paginate to that. You can also order and filtering. So like I'm actually just grabbing open issues, because why would I want to work on closed issues, right? And I can order by the created that date. So I can actually order by the latest issue. So if you guys ever work in open source, usually the last issue is probably the one that no one's working on. It's just like mathematics. Yeah, so I'm just ordering it by the last issue that was open. And I just said that, and then I told you about filtering. And this is me paginating. And this is me paginating issue data. So all the edges, they have this thing called a cursor. It's very common in like REST APIs for people to throw something this. GitHub has this for you already. So if you're paginating through like 5, you can actually find the cursor and just get the next 5 after the cursor. You guys use APIs before? Yeah, I'm just saying it's like a pretty common concept of using pagination. So you just find the cursor and then go after the cursor of the 5 that you're looking at. So offsetting, I guess, is the term I should have just used. I'm going to save a live demo for the end. I'm just going to get through mutations, and then I'll show me going through GraphQL query, because I think we're done 3:15. So we have 15 minutes. Don't have that many slides left. So mutations. So this is the one I was talking about, add reactions to an issue. This is actually a feature that came out last fall, which is literally, you guys know what this feature is? Reactions? Just by looking at the code? It's this. So it's the emojis. They call it reactions in the API. So I can add an emoji, and I can add an emoji based on what I'm looking for, which is a heart. I just want to add a heart to the actual subject ID. And this subject ID is the ID that actually gets generated by our API. So actually it gets generated in the GraphQL schema. So it's different than your actual ID in your database. You can make it, so whoever builds a schema, you decide, depending on how you build the schema. At GitHub, we're using the GraphQL Ruby gem because our backend is Ruby. And that's how we interface, like our backend is Rails, if you guys weren't aware. But we're just using the default stuff that gets generated from GraphQL. So it's pretty unique. And I just find that issue that I already knew what the ID for. You can use code to discover issues and stuff like that. Code's magic, and then I just add a heart to it. So, and the way I learned how to do that is through documentation. That's literally in the GraphQL. So I was just like, how do I do this thing? Actually, what I did was I actually gave this talk last year, a very small, like shorter version of it. And I realized I never did a mutation in GitHub. So the first thing I did was actually go to the documentation and then search for mutations. So you can literally just type mutation in the documentation. And it gave me like 4 mutations I could do. So at the time, GitHub was still new on actually letting you do a lot of stuff in GraphQL. And of the 4 mutations, this one was the most interesting. So I just did that one. We actually have way more mutations. I think we're up to like 30 or 40. And I'll tell you, if there's something that you wanted to do, there's a way to ask for it. Not me. So this is, I'm going to talk about saving data. And this is like me persisting data. So keep your ears up if I don't answer your question. So basically, I'm using GraphQL, which is another provider. It's a GraphQL database as a service. So I didn't build the schema for this. I wanted to try out a service that did it. That was sort of like owning Hacker News at the time as far as GraphQL goes. And what I did to interface between my JavaScript React library and that GraphQL schema was Apollo. So far, I haven't used Apollo up until now. I was actually just using fetching and Axios to fetch data through JavaScript from the api.github.com/GraphQL. And this one I'm doing differently, mainly because this was me learning how to use it. I'd probably use the same, like either go one way or the other if you want to do your own project. But since I was testing this out as like a side project, I used 2 different ways. Not recommended. So Apollo has a lot of built-in stuff for you. It's a library. It's open source. They give you a lot of stuff for free. They take away a lot of stuff for money. Or they give you a lot of stuff for money too as well. So I'm using that, and I am basically taking my GraphQL endpoint, which I'm actually saving an environment variable. I'm taking that and basically processing that. So that way in my React app, Apollo has Apollo React. They have Apollo Vue, they have Apollo Angular. They have like Apollo clients for front-end JavaScript clients. They even have like a Swift and I don't know if they have Android. I'm not sure. But they have all these clients to consume as like a front-end or client developer or mobile client developer. So I'm just using that, following their best practice and patterns. So I just wanted to point out that that's what I'm doing here. And the Apollo provider is just a React thing. If you guys don't do React, it really does not matter. But just know that like I'm using Apollo to consume my GraphQL, and then I get a lot of stuff for free because of that. Saving notes. So I can hit the save button. I don't think I actually showed this yet. I think this is actually what we're looking at. So I created a mutation called update repository. I called it update because I wanted to save and create to be the same thing. I probably should have just called it save and create instead of update, but naming is hard. All right, so update is save and create, and that's just me. I'm saving the ID and I'm saving notes, and I'm sending that to GraphQL. And that's what this form looks like. Pretty good design, huh? It's green and red. All right, so that's just me doing that. This is me doing my note mutation directly in line in my React app. Anybody do React here? A handful of us, so I won't spend too much time on it. Just know that this code works, I promise. This is more React code. So I just kind of showed you how I save it, how I'm persisting data. If I killed the browser, I'm not saving it, actually persisting it in like any sort of database other than GraphQL. Like I'm pulling on, when I start my app, I'm pulling it all from GraphQL. Everything I've saved so far, it just comes directly from the Apollo client, and that gets persisted there. Every time I want to scrape data from GitHub, like literally, it's my scraper of GitHub is that form. So I put the URL, I scrape it, and if I want to keep the data, I save it. If I don't, then I just move on. So it's just mainly me to scrape GitHub and look at it within a GUI interface. GraphQL is saving my stuff. So does GraphQL kill REST? What do you guys think? No, it doesn't. GitHub version 4, it is on GraphQL. The only thing is that the REST API is never going away. Like we've decided that as internally as GitHub, like we're not going to get rid of REST because a lot of people depend on it. A lot of our enterprise customers depend on it. There's no reason to go, scorch the earth and burn our disco records in the middle of Boston or wherever the Red Sox, baseball, wherever they play, Fenway Park. Yeah. I love baseball. I don't like baseball. Anyway, so we're not going to scorch the earth. We're not getting rid of REST. Like we actually are still adding stuff to it. We're still supporting it. We're keeping parity up with the GraphQL API. There's certain things that we're not adding to the adding to REST. So certain things like things that consume data, third-party marketplace. So we have a what am I calling it? It's like an e-commerce store for integrations for your GitHub repos. So you can add things like Microsoft's like Azure pipelines, or you can add Travis and all these other tools. That's actually all GraphQL. Like we've decided consumer facing, let's not worry about things that we are scared to put out there because we think people are going to abuse it. Like we can actually set limits a lot easier using our schemas and setting like, yes, a lot of the problems that we have with REST, we can actually solve through GraphQL. Now, I mentioned that there's some things that aren't out there, like some things you would like to do, like maybe even add notifications or all the stuff that you would like to do in GraphQL or even consume. We do have a community, which is platform.github.community. It's a discourse forum, and you can actually see everybody how they're working GraphQL and actually ask questions from the team and ask questions on specific endpoints, give your business reason why you need it, and we could probably put it in the roadmap. A lot of people don't. This is specifically for GraphQL and API, so we don't really mention this unless it's in the context of GraphQL or GitHub's API. We're not going to add like new buttons in your pull request GUI because that's not that team. This is more API. So if you have API questions, you want to see people working on stuff or what they're working on. We were keeping the roadmap up to date, but it turns out keeping the roadmap up to date for 28 million developers worldwide is kind of hard. So we don't keep them up to date as well, but you can always ask questions. I do want to go through really quickly before I go into some live demoing, some other resources for GraphQL. I talked about graph.cool is actually the URL. They're called GraphQL. They just actually rebranded and open sourced their entire project and called it Prisma. So GraphQL, you'll find a lot of cool documentation and stuff like that. You can still use them. But Prisma is a cool CLI client that you can actually start GraphQL from scratch. and it'll even give you a Docker container, or sorry, it'll give you a Docker file, and you can actually deploy that to AWS or wherever you want to deploy it. It actually gives you choices. So it's actually really cool. It's very similar to like Zeitz now. Prisma is doing that for GraphQL. So if you have a GraphQL schema or a backend, or you are a backend developer and you want to share this with your team, it's really good for prototyping. This is how you npm install it. Just Prisma init, and then you could build your schema by hand. Now, I didn't talk anything about schemas because I'm almost out of time, and I went through all this only talking about consuming. But building a schema is just as simple as like pairing it with your current like SQL, Postgres, whatever your backend database that your choice. Mongo, is that still a thing? Just kidding, it is. You can actually pair that with Prisma, and then you can ship that in a Docker container as well. There's another group. Actually, there's a few people, some people from the Prisma team and some people from other various teams created a GraphQL CLI. So you can actually create a GraphQL schema on the command line. There's also a lot of other tools that you can actually just take your current database and it will infer GraphQL schemas for you. So GraphQL Ruby is one of them. It's a Ruby gem if you do Rails. There's definitely a .NET one. There's a lot of Mongo ones, and where you just run the command line. It looks at your database. So like, make sure you want something to look at your database, and because that's not a thing for everybody. And it will build out a schema for you and do most of the work for you. And you just kind of have to clean up syntactical stuff. If you wanted to check out GraphQL outside of the GitHub context, there is a cool site. It's called How to GraphQL. Who would have thought that would have been a URL available? It is. And you can actually learn getting started with like a full stack GraphQL app. I forgot what the subject matter is. They've actually changed it since they first launched it. I think the first time it was a intercom. You guys ever use intercom, a little chatbot for some of these startups? They had the intercom and you can chat. They built that app using GraphQL. So it might still be that, or they might have changed it. I'm not sure. But it's open source, so it's constantly always being updated. And that's why I was saying that like all the languages that are supported, it's because open source. So open source for the win. GraphQL Playground, definitely something if you want to play around with data or play around with your own endpoints, you can actually provide an endpoint for you. You can provide the api.github.com/GraphQL if you wanted to, or any other ones out there. Like Yelp has one. I think Yelp is the only one I know that's public. Yeah, a lot of people aren't as cool as GitHub, just putting out GraphQL like that. So it's the thing. Apollo Launchpad. This is a really cool. I did a talk at GraphQL Summit last year where I did this whole talk about wrap and wrappers. Where I built a GraphQL gateway. So I had a REST API and I had a front end. Actually, it was a React Native app, so a mobile app. And I wanted to take my work app and put it on my phone because I used my work app at my last job a lot, and I wanted to deploy stuff from my phone. So I built a wrapper around our current REST API, which I called a GraphQL gateway, and I did it with Apollo Launchpad. So this is like an IDE for GraphQL to build resolvers and functions and stuff like that for GraphQL and schemas. So you can do it all in line. There's also Apollo Launchpad template for Spotify. So if you just want to use another API that's not GitHub, it'll take the Spotify REST API, and then you can actually create a schema and do. Actually, they created schema for you, so you can actually test out Spotify's API through GraphQL. Even though Spotify does not have a public GraphQL API, like they literally built one for them. So you can take any. So the question about like REST is dead. Like REST is not dead. Like REST is like powering a lot of GraphQL apps today, including GitHub. This is the repo. It's called Open Sauce. This is the project I was talking about. Again, not crazy UI. If you're a designer, if you know designers, they can commit all the code, design code, CSS if they want. It was mainly, as I said, I just tried a lot of stuff. It's nonsensical. It's not the greatest code. There are maybe one or two tests. It's not right. It's just basically serving one customer, but it's out there. It's on GitHub because that's the place you put open source, right? So REST is not dead. And let me just land this plane and make it full circle. Like you could sample GraphQL by literally using your GitHub data. So as I mentioned before, developer.github.com and find the GraphQL Explorer and just try it out. Like this is stuff you can do in there that's really cool. This is like the picture of my project that I was talking about doing the API gateway. So there's this new thing that came out last year called schema stitching, where you can actually take your schema. So I had two different schemas. I had the GraphQL one that was saving notes, and I had GitHub. Now, if I wanted to persist that data, I could actually combine them and schema stitch them into one backend. So it's something that's getting really popular, and people are starting to figure out. It helps with caching. So like, imagine you already fetched my repo, and you don't want to fetch it again. Like it's already cached in memory. You can do caching, so it helps performance. Everybody knows how caching works. Well, if you don't know how caching works, ask me after. But yeah, you want to save it and persist that. I repeated that slide again for some reason, but I had this slide because I was super proud of myself, and I got a TLD that was opensauce.pizza. I should go into marketing. And then developer.github.com. If you did not hear what I was saying because I was talking too fast, that is the site to find out about our API, about GraphQL. We've got tutorials, we've got getting started, stuff like that. I do want to say that we have a program, which is like the GitHub developer program. So if you want to get emails from me about like new API endpoints, things you can do with GitHub, hear about other people who've built stuff on top of GitHub. Pull Reminders just did a article on indie hackers about how he's making $5,500 a month on basically a thing he thought of while he was on a developer or engineering team, and he built a GitHub app, and now he's quit his job and he's doing that full time. So it's possible. Definitely check that out. Like we sent his story out 2 months ago, and with my last slide, don't get lost, stay saucy. Those are my slides, but also I'm going to definitely hook the organizers up with my slides because there's a lot of information. A lot of people, this is new for you. This is me on Twitter, BDougEO. All right, so we have 5 minutes. I just wanted to show you the Explorer. I'm actually surprised. I thought I was going to go like 45 minutes and then like tinker for like the rest of the time. And I even talked fast too, right? All right.